There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a hospital room, and if you have never heard it, I hope to God you never do. It is not the silence of a library or the quiet of an early morning before anyone else is awake. It is something heavier, something that presses down on your chest and sits there, patient and cruel, like it has all the time in the world. It is the silence of a place where people come to fight for their lives, and sometimes lose. I know that silence the way I know my own heartbeat. I lived inside it for the better part of a year, and for 6 of the most important hours of that year, I lived inside it completely alone. My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old now. I have short hair that finally grew back after the chemo, and a small white scar just below my left collarbone where the port used to be, and a laugh that people tell me lights up a room. Though I suspect it only seems that way, because there were months when I didn't laugh at all. And the contrast has a way of making things appear brighter than they actually are. I live alone in a small apartment with too many houseplants and a cat named Margot, who thinks she owns every surface in the place. And most days I feel like the version of myself I always meant to become. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins 3 years ago, in a different apartment, a different city, and a different life. One I thought was solid, one I thought was mine, and one I would watch shatter into pieces I could never quite put back together the same way. I grew up in a family that looked beautiful from the outside. Most families do, I think. We had Sunday dinners and birthday cakes with too many candles and 100 photographs on the living room wall, all of us smiling in matching outfits the way my mother insisted on at least once a year. My mother, Diane, tall and precise, and warm in the way that certain flowers are beautiful without being soft, ran our household with the quiet authority of a woman who has decided that love is something you organize and schedule and execute properly or not at all. My father, Robert, was the kind of man who apologized for the weather. Gentle to the point of invisibility, he agreed with whatever my mother decided and filled in the spaces she left behind with laughter and terrible puns and the specific kind of peace that comes from never having an opinion that might cause conflict. And then there was Vanessa, my sister, 4 years younger than me, 3 inches taller, and with the kind of effortless, magnetic quality that makes certain people the center of every room they enter without appearing to try. She was the kind of girl who got the lead in the school play and acted surprised. The kind of woman who walked into a party and had 3 people offering her drinks before she had even taken her coat off. I don't say this with bitterness, or at least not with bitterness that was there from the beginning. I say it because it is true, and because it is necessary for understanding everything that happened after. Vanessa was the sun. The rest of us were planets. That was simply the arrangement we had all quietly agreed to without ever discussing it aloud. For most of my life, I didn't mind. I had built a world that was mine and mine alone, a career I was proud of, friends who were loyal, and a quiet contentment that I had worked hard to earn. I was a graphic designer. I had my own small studio, clients who trusted me, and a body of work I was genuinely proud of. I had an apartment full of plants and books and good lighting, and a routine that felt, on most days, like the life I had always wanted. I was not the kind of person who needed to be the center. I was the kind of person who liked watching other people shine, who found satisfaction in the steady and the reliable, in the life built slowly and carefully, brick by brick. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had a client presentation that morning, a branding project I had been working on for 3 months, something I was proud of, something I had stayed up until 2 a.m. the night before refining. I remember driving to my doctor's office afterward for what I thought was a routine follow-up, something about a scan I'd had 2 weeks earlier that she said she wanted to discuss in person. I remember thinking it was probably nothing, the kind of thing doctors say to cover their bases, the kind of appointment that takes 15 minutes and ends with them telling you to drink more water. It was not nothing. Breast cancer. Stage 2. The words came out of my doctor's mouth and I heard them, but for a moment they didn't seem to connect to anything real. They floated there in the air between us, and I watched them from a strange distance, the way you watch something happen outside a window. My doctor, Dr. Reyes, a small, precise woman with reading glasses on a chain and a voice calibrated to deliver difficult information without adding to the weight of it, walked me through what it meant, what the next steps were, what the treatment options looked like. She spoke clearly and without drama, which I appreciated. I was not able to speak at all. I drove home in complete silence. Not the heavy hospital silence, a different kind. The silence of a person reconfiguring their entire understanding of their life. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment building for 22 minutes before I could make my legs work well enough to get out. And then I went upstairs, sat down on my kitchen floor, not a chair, the floor, with my back against the cabinets. And I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. I told her what the doctor had said, and my mother, who I had always known to be a woman of practicality and efficiency, did something I had not expected and will never forget. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she said very softly, "Sarah, we are going to get through this. All of us, together." I cried then, not the quiet kind of crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep inside you that it takes your whole body with it. And my mother stayed on the phone, not saying much, just being there. And I felt in that moment that whatever was coming, I was not going to face it alone. I need you to hold on to that. I need you to hold on to how certain I was. The weeks that followed were a crash course in a world I had never wanted to know. Oncology consultations, treatment plans, chemotherapy schedules, a port installed in my chest under local anesthesia, a small device that would allow the nurses to administer the drugs without destroying my veins. I learned words I had never expected to use about my own body. I learned what it felt like to be afraid in a way that has no resolution, no action that can make it stop, only endurance. My family rallied around me in those early weeks, and I am not going to pretend that wasn't real, because it was. My mother reorganized her entire schedule to drive me to appointments. My father appeared at my door one Saturday with a cooler full of food he and my mother had cooked. Soups and casseroles and the lemon pound cake I had loved since I was 7 years old, now neatly wrapped in foil with careful labels written in my mother's handwriting. Vanessa came over 3 times in the first 2 weeks, bringing flowers and the kind of gentle, wide-eyed attention that she had always been good at when things were genuinely serious. She sat with me on my couch and let me talk, and didn't try to redirect the conversation to herself, which was, for Vanessa, a form of love I understood how to receive. I started chemotherapy on a Thursday in November. My mother sat beside me for the entire first round, 4.5 hours in a reclining chair in a treatment room that was painted a soft, inoffensive green that I suspect someone had chosen specifically for its calming properties. There were 6 other patients in the room that day. An older gentleman named Gerald who brought a crossword puzzle book and offered everyone who walked by a lemon drop candy from a Ziploc bag in his pocket. A young woman, maybe 25, who slept through most of it with headphones in. A couple. Wife in the chair, husband perched on a stool beside her, holding her hand, not talking, just there. I remember watching them and feeling something I couldn't fully name at the time. Something that looked, from the inside, like relief. Because I had my mother beside me and I was not that couple. I was not alone in the way I was afraid of being alone. My mother held my hand during the parts that were hard. She brought me ginger chews for the nausea and a soft blanket she had ordered specifically for this purpose. She read aloud from a novel I had never heard of, something about a woman who inherits a vineyard in the south of France, in the gentle, unhurried voice she had used to read to me when I was small and sick with fevers. And when the 4.5 hours were over, and I felt wrung out and strange and not quite like myself, she drove me home and stayed until I fell asleep on the couch. The second round was 3 weeks later. My father came that time and brought a thermos of ginger tea that he refilled twice from a flask he had smuggled in his jacket pocket, which made the nurses laugh. He sat across from me and told me stories from his childhood, long, rambling ones that never quite arrived at a point, and I listened to every word, because the sound of his voice was an anchor. At the end of round 2, as he drove me home, he said, "You are doing so well, sweetheart. Your mother and I are so proud of you. We are going to be here every single time, you know that, don't you?" I said that I did. I believed him. But what I didn't know that day, sitting in the passenger seat of my father's car, watching the November streetlights blur past the window, was that there was a calendar on the wall of my parents' kitchen with a date circled in red marker. A date 6 weeks away. A date that was already beginning to quietly rearrange the priorities of everyone I loved most. A date I knew existed but whose weight I had badly, catastrophically underestimated. My sister Vanessa was getting married. She had gotten engaged 8 months earlier to a man named Daniel Hargrove, 37, an architect. Handsome in the specific architectural way of men who spend a lot of time thinking about proportion and line. He had proposed to Vanessa on a rooftop in the city, with a ring that had apparently required 3 trips to the jeweler to get right, and Vanessa had posted a photograph of the moment that had received more likes than any photograph I had ever taken in my life. Daniel was steady and quiet, and deeply, completely in love with my sister, in the way that serious men sometimes fall for radiant women. All in, holding nothing back, anchored to her like she was the fixed point around which his whole world organized itself. I liked him. I genuinely liked him. He was kind to me, asked real questions, listened to the answers. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in January. When the cancer diagnosis came in October, Vanessa had called me immediately after I called our parents. She was quiet on the phone, quieter than I had ever heard her. And she said, "Sarah, I want you to know that the wedding stuff doesn't matter. None of it matters. You matter." I told her I didn't want her to feel that way. I told her I wanted her to have her wedding, that I was going to get through this, that we could hold both things at once. I was in that moment trying to be generous. I was trying to be the kind of big sister who doesn't make her illness the center of every family gathering. I was trying to make it easy for everyone. I didn't yet know how thoroughly they would take me up on that offer. Through November and December, the wedding preparations accelerated in the way that wedding preparations always do in the final stretch. Louder, more urgent, consuming more space in every conversation. And I told myself this was fine. I told myself I understood. I told myself that my mother's distracted expressions during our phone calls were about table arrangements and not about anything else. I told myself that my father's increasing absences from our visits were about errands and logistics. I told myself that Vanessa's sudden difficulty returning my texts was about dress fittings and vendor calls. I was very good at telling myself things. My 3rd round of chemotherapy was scheduled for a Thursday in early January. The rehearsal dinner was Friday. The wedding was Saturday, and 3 days before my appointment, my mother sat across from me at my kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap and told me that they would not be coming, and something inside me, something I hadn't even realized I was still holding, went very, very quiet. She didn't lead into it gently. My mother was not by nature a woman who led into things. She believed that directness was a form of respect, which in most circumstances I agreed with. She sat down across from me, folded her hands the way she did when she had already made a decision, and was informing me of it, rather than discussing it, and she said, "Sarah, I need to talk to you about Thursday. The rehearsal dinner is Friday night, and there's an enormous amount of preparation that has to happen on Thursday. The wedding coordinator needs us there by noon. And I know this isn't ideal, but we're going to need to miss your appointment. Just this one." I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she started to shift in her chair. "Just this one?" I said it quietly, the way you say something when you are giving someone the chance to hear how it sounds out loud. "Sarah, you've been so strong through all of this. Dr. Reyes said round 3 is difficult, but you've handled the first 2 better than anyone expected. You're going to be fine." There it was, the word strong, the word that people use when they want to give you a compliment and take something from you at the same time. The word that means we believe in you, and also, please don't need us for this. I asked her if she had spoken to my father. She said yes. I asked her if Vanessa knew. She said she hadn't wanted to stress Vanessa with it, not this close to the wedding. I absorbed that. The idea that my cancer treatment was a stressor to be managed around my sister's feelings. I held that sentence up in the light of my mind and looked at every surface of it. I said, "Mom, I was told I shouldn't be alone for these sessions. The doctor said round 3 tends to be the hardest. She said I need someone there in case the reaction is serious." My mother's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It softened slightly, in the way of someone managing guilt rather than feeling it fully. "I know, sweetheart. And I've thought about this. Can you call a friend? What about Claire?" "Claire. My friend Claire, who lived 45 minutes away and had 3 children under the age of 5 and was in the middle of a job transition. Claire, who I hadn't wanted to burden with any of this in the first place because she had enough on her plate. Claire, who I would now apparently need to call and ask to drive me to chemotherapy because my family had a seating chart to finalize. I did not say any of that. I nodded. I told my mother I would figure it out. I waited until she left, and then I sat in my kitchen for a very long time, looking at a crack in the wall near the baseboard that I had been meaning to fix for 6 months. And I breathed, and I thought about every version of this conversation that might have gone differently, and eventually I made myself stand up and make a cup of tea. My father did not come to tell me himself. He sent a text message. I have kept it, it said. Honey, your mother explained everything. We love you so much. You're our strong girl. See you after the weekend. With a heart emoji at the end. A heart emoji. As if that were a thing that adequately represented the situation. Vanessa called the next evening. She had, apparently, been told. Not about missing my appointment, but simply that I was doing well and that the wedding weekend was going to be beautiful and that she shouldn't worry. She called me full of nervous, excited energy, talking about centerpieces and ceremony music and the something blue she had finally chosen, and I sat on my couch and listened, and I said the right things. And she never once asked how I was feeling. Not once. Not a single question about the appointment that was in 2 days. Either she didn't know, or she didn't ask because she didn't want to. I was not sure, at the time, which was worse. Thursday morning, I woke up at 6. I had set an alarm even though I hadn't slept. I showered, dressed in layers because the treatment room was always cold, packed my bag with the things I had learned over 2 rounds to bring. Ginger chews, a water bottle, the soft blanket my mother had bought me, a novel I wouldn't be able to concentrate on, headphones, a phone charger. I called a car service because I didn't trust myself to drive afterward. I rode to the hospital in the back seat watching the city go past the window. And I thought about the rehearsal dinner that was happening the next evening, and about my mother choosing a tablecloth, and about my father pouring champagne, and I pressed the thought down and focused on breathing. The nurse who checked me in that morning was a woman named Patricia. She had done my first 2 sessions and she remembered me. She asked how I was doing, who I had brought with me today. I told her I was alone. She paused for just a fraction of a second before her face reassembled itself into its professional warmth. And she said, "All right, sweetheart. I'll check on you a little more today, okay? You just wave if you need anything." I said thank you. I sat down in the recliner. She hooked up the IV with the careful efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times. And the cold of the saline started up my arm, and I opened my novel to page 1. And I did not read a single word. Round 3 was, as Dr. Reyes had warned, harder. The nausea arrived earlier and stayed longer. There was a headache that settled in behind my eyes somewhere around the 2nd hour, that no amount of water or the small crackers Patricia brought me would touch. My hands were cold in a way that felt like it went all the way through to the bone. I had my blanket over my lap and my headphones in, and I had made a playlist of music that I loved. Not sad music. I had specifically avoided sad music, and I sat there for 4 hours and 20 minutes, and I endured. At some point in the 3rd hour, the older gentleman from my first session was there, Gerald, with the crossword puzzle book. He was in the chair 2 spaces down, and he caught my eye at some point and raised his hand in a small wave, and I raised mine back. He didn't ask where my support person was. He just nodded, in the way of someone who has seen this before and understands it without needing it explained. I was grateful for that. When it was over, Patricia helped me gather my things. She walked me to the lobby and waited with me until my car arrived. She was not required to do this. She did it anyway. Before she went back inside, she put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "You did good today. I mean it. Take care of yourself this weekend." I got into the car. I rode home. I made it to my couch before the full force of the exhaustion hit me, and I lay there in my coat because I couldn't summon the energy to take it off, and I looked at the ceiling, and I had made that decision on my kitchen floor the night before, somewhere around midnight, lying in the dark with Margot the cat pressed against my side and the sound of the city outside doing its indifferent city things. I had thought about walking into that wedding, about smiling, about standing in the family photographs at the reception, hollow-eyed and pale, making sure not to make it about me. About toasting my sister's happiness with a raised glass while still wearing the bruise on my arm where the IV had been. And I thought, no. I am not going to perform this. I called my mother at 7 a.m, and I told her I wasn't feeling well enough to attend. She accepted this immediately, perhaps with some relief. I couldn't tell from her voice, which was warm and rushed and already oriented toward the day ahead. She told me to rest. She told me she loved me. She told me Vanessa would understand. She did not ask if I needed anything. She did not offer to stay. I spent the day of my sister's wedding in my apartment. I put on a movie I had already seen 3 times, something comforting and low stakes. I ate crackers and the remnants of a soup my father had brought 2 weeks earlier. I did not look at social media. I called my friend Claire in the afternoon, not to unload, just to talk. And Claire, who knew me well enough to understand when I was holding something difficult, asked me gently how I was really doing, and I said, "I don't know yet. I think I'm still deciding." She laughed, softly, and said that was the most honest thing I had ever said. And we talked for an hour about nothing and everything, and it was the best conversation I had that whole month. That evening, the photographs arrived. Hundreds of them, shared across family group chats and social media accounts. The ceremony, the reception, the first dance, the cake. Vanessa was breathtaking. Daniel looked at her like she was the only fixed point in the universe. The venue was warm and golden, and everything a wedding is supposed to be. In every photograph, my family's faces were full of a joy so complete, it almost looked like a different species of emotion from anything I had felt in months. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I put my phone away. In the days and weeks that followed the wedding, my family drifted back into contact with me the way water finds its way back after a tide has gone out. Gradually, quietly, as if the departure had been natural, and the return was simply the next thing that happened. My mother called more frequently. My father reappeared with food and terrible puns. Vanessa sent a postcard from her honeymoon in Portugal. A postcard, which I thought was sweet in a way that was also insufficient. With a message that said, "Miss you, big sis. So glad you were with us in spirit." In spirit. I had been in the hospital the day before her wedding, and I had been with them in spirit. None of them acknowledged what had happened. None of them said, "We made a choice, and the choice hurt you, and we are sorry." They stepped around it the way you step around a wet floor with a sign on it. Carefully, deliberately, without acknowledging the sign. And I let them, because I was exhausted and still sick, and because fighting requires energy that I did not have, and because part of me still wanted to believe that we could come back from this without having to name it. But something had shifted inside me. Something quiet and permanent. I had spent 3 years before the cancer building a life that felt solid and mine, and then the illness had stripped away a great deal of the surface of that life. And what was underneath, what the stripping revealed, was that the foundation I had thought I was standing on was thinner than I had known. I finished my remaining rounds of chemotherapy across the next 3 months. My mother came to round 4. A friend, a colleague named May, who I was not even particularly close to, who had simply heard what was happening and offered and meant it, came to rounds 5 and 6. Vanessa, now returned from Portugal and settled into her married life, sent a gift basket to my apartment after round 5. It contained candles and bath salts and a card that said, "You are so strong."
Almost there!
I put the candles on a shelf. I lit one eventually. It smelled like lavender, and the smell made me think of my grandmother, who had died the year before, who had been the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and said, "I see you." Sarah, not the capable one, not the quiet one, not the easy one. You. I missed her with a sharpness that still caught me off guard. The last round of chemotherapy was a Thursday in March. I rode there alone, because that had become the arrangement, and I rode home alone. And I stood in my bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror, pale, thin, the barest suggestion of hair returning along my hairline, the port scar just visible above the neckline of my shirt. And I thought, you did this. You did it, and you are still here, and no one is going to take that from you. I cried then, but they were different tears from the ones that had come before. They were not grief, not anger, not exhaustion. They were the tears of a person arriving at the end of something terrible and understanding, with perfect clarity, what the terrible thing had cost, and what it had, unexpectedly, given. It had given me my own measure. I knew now, precisely, what I was made of. Not because anyone had told me. Not because someone had held my hand through every hard moment, but because I had sat in that treatment chair alone and gotten through it, hour after hour, appointment after appointment, and I was still here on the other side. And I also knew, with the same precision, the same clarity, what the people around me were made of. What they were capable of when the cost of showing up was higher than they wanted to pay. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't stage a dramatic reckoning. I didn't write the letter or make the call or send the group message I had drafted and deleted 17 times in the dark hours of my worst nights. I simply adjusted. My radius of trust recalibrated itself, quietly and completely, and I began building my life along its new lines. I grew closer to May, who became one of my closest friends. I called Claire Moore. I found a therapist, Dr. Okonkwo, whose calm and clarity turned out to be exactly what I needed. And I started to actually talk about what had happened instead of folding it away. I went back to my work, slowly at first, then with increasing energy, and I found that the months of illness had done something unexpected to my creative sense, had stripped away the things I had been doing out of habit, and left only the things I genuinely cared about. The work I was making because it meant something and not because it was safe. My family remained in my life. I did not cut them off. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about cutting people off. It is a story about seeing clearly, about understanding who you are to the people who love you, and what that love actually looks like in practice, and deciding what to do with that understanding. I continued to go to Sunday dinners. I continued to be present for birthdays and holidays. I was warm. I was engaged. I was the Sarah they had always known. But I was also keeping score. Not in the vindictive sense. Not in the sense of building toward something I was planning to deploy. Just remembering, quietly noting what was real and what was performance. Filing things away in a part of myself that I had learned, through illness, to trust. And I waited, not for revenge, for truth. Because truth, I had learned, eventually finds its way to the surface whether you help it or not. 2 years passed. They were good years, or at least they were years in which I discovered new capacities for good. My hair grew back. Not the same as before. Curlier and with a different texture that I eventually decided I liked better, which felt like a small private joke the universe was making. My energy returned. My practice grew. I hired a part-time assistant. I moved apartments. A new place, a little larger, with a window in the kitchen that got the morning light in a way that made me happy every single day. I got Margot a companion cat, a small gray creature with enormous opinions whom I named Theodore. I was by most measures thriving. And that fact, the fact of my own flourishing, it was, I think, the most complete form of justice I could have asked for. Not because it proved anything to anyone else, but because it proved something to me. That the year of illness, and the loneliness and the quiet grief of discovering what I was worth to the people I loved most, none of it had broken me in any permanent way. It had reshaped me, but reshaping is not the same as breaking. Vanessa and Daniel had settled into their married life with the ease of two people who were genuinely suited to each other. I saw them at family gatherings. I was cordial with Daniel, who had always been kind, who I suspected knew more about what had happened than he ever indicated. Vanessa and I maintained the surface of a relationship, text messages on birthdays, attendance at the same events, the performance of sisterhood that both of us had learned from our mother. But something between us had changed. She felt it. I could tell she felt it, in the way she sometimes looked at me with an expression that was part confusion, part something else, something that might have been regret, if she had let herself acknowledge what it was. I was not trying to punish her with my distance. I want to be careful about that, because the distinction matters. I was not performing coldness in order to make her suffer. I was simply being honest about what I had available to give. I had finite emotional resources, and I had learned to spend them where they were matched. Vanessa was... Then I said, I know. I've been there, and I'm going to help you. She started crying again. She said she didn't deserve that. I told her that deserving wasn't the point. Her first treatment appointment was on a Tuesday. I drove. I sat in the waiting room while they set up the IV, and then I sat beside her in the treatment room for the entire 4 hours. I brought ginger chews and a soft blanket and a thermos of ginger tea. I brought a novel, not to read to her, just to have something to hold while she slept, which she did for much of it. I watched the bag of medication drip slowly down its tube, and I thought about all the Tuesdays I had spent in rooms like this. And I felt something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it, a kind of completion. Partway through the second hour, Vanessa woke up. She looked at me for a moment, the way you look at someone when you are not quite sure what they represent. And then she said quietly, "You came," I said. "Of course I came." She looked at the IV in her arm, at the room around us, at the other patients in their recliners, each of them in their own private battle, and I watched something move across her face. Not a single expression, but a sequence of them. The way weather changes across a field. Visible and complete. Understanding, recognition, grief. She said, "Is this what it was like? For you?" I considered how to answer that honestly. "Yes," I said. Mostly. The first 2 times I had someone with me. The third time I was alone. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the third time was when she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We both knew what the third time was. She closed her eyes and 2 tears went down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. I didn't say anything to fill the silence. I let it sit. I let her feel what she needed to feel. After a minute or 2, I handed her a ginger chew, and she took it, and eventually she opened her eyes again and looked at me, and I recognized the look she had on her face. It was the look of a person arriving at the truth of something they have been avoiding for a very long time. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I am so sorry we weren't there." I looked at my sister, 31 years old, afraid, small in a way she had never allowed herself to be. And I thought about every version of this moment I had imagined over 2.5 years. The angry version, where I said everything I had held back. The cold version, where I smiled and told her it was fine. The wounded version, where I let her see exactly how much it had cost me. None of those were the version that came. What came was something quieter than all of them. "I know you are," I said. "And I forgive you. Not because it didn't hurt. Because it did, more than I know how to explain. But I forgive you because you're my sister and because being here today, being in this room, is more important to me than being right about what happened in the past." She took my hand. I let her hold it. We sat like that for the rest of the session. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in our family. It started small, my mother calling not with the carefully arranged pleasantness she had used since the wedding, but with something unguarded, something that acknowledged, without ever quite saying it directly, that she was aware of what had happened, and that it weighed on her. My father showed up at my apartment one evening unannounced, stood in the doorway and said, "I should have been at that appointment, Sarah. I should have been there. I've thought about it 100 times and I don't have a good reason. I just want you to know I know that." I looked at my father, my gentle, conflict-avoiding father, who had driven me home from that second round of chemo and told me he'd be there every time, and I felt, for the first time in years, that I was seeing him clearly and not with the soft filter of what I wished he was. He was a man who loved me, and who had failed me, and who knew it. That was the truth of him. That was the full picture. "I know, Dad," I said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." There was no dramatic confrontation. No family meeting where everything was named and processed and resolved. That is not how most real things are resolved, in my experience. What happened instead was gradual and messy and incomplete, in the way that all human repair is incomplete. We worked with what we had. We moved forward, carefully, with the new understanding of each other that the last 2 years had produced. Vanessa finished her treatment in the summer. Her prognosis was good, not without worry, not without ongoing monitoring, but good. She came through it changed. The way people who go through serious illness always come through changed. More present, less performative, more genuinely interested in the people around her than in how she appeared to them. I watched this change happen, and I received it as the gift it was. One evening in late summer, the two of us were sitting on my building's rooftop. I had a key, a benefit of befriending the building manager, watching the sun go down over the city, the kind of evening that makes you feel, briefly, that everything is going to be okay. She had brought a bottle of wine. I had brought crackers and the good cheese. She said, "I've been thinking about something you said. In the treatment room, that first day. You said you forgave me, but not because it didn't hurt. And I've been sitting with that, because I think I always thought forgiveness meant it didn't count. Like if you forgave me, then it meant what I did was fine. But that's not what you meant, was it?" I poured wine into her glass. Thought about it. "No," I said. "What I meant was that I understand why people do things that hurt other people. Fear. Avoidance. The gap between who we mean to be and who we actually are when things get hard. I understand all of that. Forgiving you doesn't erase what happened. It just means I'm not going to let what happened be the thing that defines us going forward." She was quiet for a moment. "Did it change things? Between you and Mom and Dad and me? Permanently?" I thought about that, honestly, before answering. "Yes," I said. "But not in the way I thought it would when I was in the middle of it. I thought it was going to destroy something, and in some ways it did. It destroyed a version of the family I thought we were. But I think what we are now is actually truer. I know what you're capable of and what you're not. I know what I can ask for and what I have to find elsewhere. That's not worse than not knowing. It's actually better. It's just harder." She nodded slowly. We watched the light change over the buildings. "I want to be better," she said finally. "I know that's not enough on its own, but I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "I believe you." And I did. That was the most surprising part. After everything, after all the nights on the kitchen floor and the treatment room silences and the photographs of the rehearsal dinner and the 2 years of recalibrated trust, I sat on that rooftop with my sister, and I genuinely believed that she wanted to be better. Not because I had made her believe it through some form of strategic behavior, not because the circumstances had forced her hand, but because going through her own illness had given her access to a truth that only illness can teach. The truth of your own smallness, your own need, the way the world does not arrange itself around your importance. She had learned what I had learned, just later, and with me beside her. I think about that a lot, actually. The timing of things, the way certain understandings can only be reached through experience and not through instruction. I could have told Vanessa, that January, exactly what it had cost me to sit alone in that treatment room. I could have described it precisely. She would have listened. She would have felt sorry. And none of that would have given her what 2 hours in her own treatment chair gave her. The visceral, body-level knowledge of what it means to be afraid and sick, and to look beside you, and see someone who stayed. There is a certain kind of justice that does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with confrontation or exposure or the public consequences we imagine for people who have failed us. It arrives quietly in the form of understanding, in the form of truth finding its way to the surface without being forced there. I am not glad my sister got sick. I want to be very clear about that. There is no version of me that wanted this particular form of justice. But I am grateful, deeply and genuinely grateful, for what her illness gave us both. For the conversations it made possible, for the version of our relationship that exists now, which is more honest and more careful, and more real than anything we had before the cancer. My family is not the family I thought I had. They are a family of people who are doing their best and frequently falling short of it, who love me in ways that are real but imperfect, who have demonstrated both their capacity for failure and their capacity for repair. That is, I have come to understand, the truth of most families. The ones that look beautiful from the outside are rarely the ones that feel that way from within, and the ones that survive the truth of themselves. That is something worth having. I am still friends with May, still close to Claire, still seeing Dr. Okonkwo every 2 weeks, still living in the apartment with the good kitchen light and the 2 cats and the houseplants, still doing the work that matters to me, still choosing every day to build a life along the lines of what is real, rather than what I wish were real. My scans are clear. Have been for 2 years. I go every 6 months and I sit in the waiting room and I breathe carefully. And then I get the results and I drive home and I sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea and I think, still here, still.